In this video, we'll review what you may already know about roots, and we'll also talk about radicals. So you probably already know what a square root is, but that's okay, we'll talk about it anyway. So if I say the square root of 25, and I'll use the word square root for a special reason. If I say the square root of 25, what am I referring to? Well, what I'm referring to here is the number or numbers that if I multiply it by itself, I'll get 25. So the square root of 25 is 5, but there is another one because there is another number that when you multiply it by itself, you get 25. And that other number is -5. Now, if I instead used the radical sign, so the square root of 25, it kind of reads the same, right? The square root of 25 is still 5, obviously. The same number multiplied by itself gives you 25. Now, 5 is called the principal root. It's the positive square root of 25. However, is it the case that the square root, if I use the radical sign here, is it the case that this is also equal to -5? It is actually not the case. In order to get the other square root from that radical sign, you actually have to write negative square root of 25. So if I say the words square root of 25, I'm referring to both the positive and the negative square root. But if I use my square root sign here, my radical sign here, it only gives you the positive or the principal root. You have to actually write the negative before the square root to get the other negative root. So for example, if you're solving this very simple basic equation here, where x squared is equal to 16, well, we know that x would have to be the square root of 16 if we square root both sides. However, it is important that we remember that it's not just the square root, the positive square root, it is also the negative square root, and that's how that's written, plus or minus 16. So that means that x is equal to positive or -4, which is the same thing as actually saying positive 4 or -4. So the point of that is just to remind you that it's super important that you remember that there is a positive square root as well as a negative square root. All right, so let's talk about other roots for a moment. The root that will most often work with is square root, and you saw that when we use the square root symbol, there was no number right here. When there's no number right here, we assume that there is a 2 right here, and that's to find square root. And that's what we just spoke about, square root. However, we can have cube root, fourth root, fifth root, any root really. So if we're being asked for another root, the number right here will have to be placed. So we would have to put, for example, a 3 right here if we're being asked for cube root. So if we're being asked for cube root of a number, let's say the number is 8, we're being asked what number if you multiply it by itself 3 times, and the 3 is what you get right here. So if you multiply that number by itself 3 times, what number would give you 8? And so, well, I think you guys figured it out probably by now, but that cube root of 8 is 2, because when you multiply it by itself 3 times, it gives you 8. All right, we could do the same thing for fourth root, fifth root, sixth root, whatever. It just becomes a little bit harder to see the number. So let's do one more and then keep moving. All right, so for example, the fifth root of 243. Harder to figure it out, but as you know, since this number here is 5, they're really asking what do you multiply by itself 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times. That would give you 243. And if you check it out, that number is actually going to be, and you can do trial and error to figure it out, but that number is actually 3. Alright, so that's how root works. I just have one more thing before this video ends that's super important. So let's talk about the sign and what each thing is called in the sign. Okay, so right here I have a gigantic radical symbol or root symbol. And I just want to point out what each thing is called because later on we'll be referring to things by their proper name and we'll have to talk about these things. And I don't want you to be confused. So the first thing that I want to tell you about is that n. So the little number that we use, 2 for square root, 3 for cube root, 4 for fourth root, so on and so forth, that number is called the index. So if I say, okay, we're doing a square root question, what is the index? The index would be 2 because it's square root. If I say we're doing a cube root question, the index is 3. So that's important to remember that that's called the index. It is also important to remember that this is called the radicand. So that's the number being rooted. So the first example we did, we were finding the square root of 25. So in this case, the index was 2, and the radicand, I like how that sounds, was 25. Alright, so the number under the square root sign is our radicand. And, of course, this is just our radical sign. And that's kind of more obvious and not really as important to remember because you'll know, well, it's just a radical sign. Alright, so that's it for now, and I'll see you soon.